In the forgotten corners of the world, where roads vanish into moss and memory, old beliefs still breathe. Welcome to Folk Fear, a place where cursed traditions cling like damp soil, and grief is passed down like an heirloom. Here we tell stories not meant to be remembered, of rituals whispered in dead languages, of spirits born from sorrow, and of villages too quiet to be trusted. Tonight we descend into the forest, to a village veiled in pine and silence. Every 7 years they buried a girl alive beneath the roots, not to kill her, but to feed the land with her sorrow. But one mother broke the pact, and now something buried has returned. This is The Buried Daughter, a folk horror tale of grief that festers, of blood that betrays, and of trees that remember everything, even the screams.
The village had no name on any map. No signs pointed toward it. No travelers passed through. It was a place swallowed by pine. 100 crooked houses crouched between trees so tall they bent toward the sky like prayer-weary hands. The forest breathed with them, old, slow, and watching. The villagers didn't speak of what lived beyond the tree line, but they listened, because the forest always whispered back. Tonight, it whispered louder. A hush blanketed the village as dusk fell. Not a peaceful silence, but a heavy one, like the woods were holding their breath. Smoke curled from chimneys, but no meals were cooked. Doors were bolted, curtains drawn. The only movement came from the winding path that led toward the forest's oldest tree, and from the girl walking it. Her name was Elisna. She was 7, small for her age, quiet even before she was chosen. She didn't cry, didn't speak, only clutched the faded blue ribbon in her hand, the one her mother tied into her hair each morning since she was old enough to walk. Tonight, her hair was unbraided. The ribbon was loose. Behind her, a procession of villagers followed, faces masked with ash, eyes downcast. No one sang. At the head of the line walked the priest, garbed in robes the color of dead bark, stitched with runes older than the village itself. In his hand, a bell made of bone. It didn't ring, not until the last step. Beside Elisna walked her mother, Mara, pale, still. Her lips were bitten raw from silence. Her husband had died the year before, and now her daughter was being taken, by tradition, by obligation, by something far older than reason. She didn't scream. That was forbidden. To scream during the bending was to curse the next 7 winters. They reached the glade. At the center stood the tree, so massive its trunk looked like a dozen trees fused into one. Bark blackened by time, branches tangled like veins. It was called the elder root, and its roots spread wider than any home in the village. At its base was the cradle. Not a wooden one, not for sleep. This was a hollow carved into the earth beneath the elder tree, ringed with old stones and lined with preserved pine needles. No one knew who first dug it. No one dared make another. The priest raised the bell. 1 chime. The wind shifted. 2 chimes. The branches above began to sway, though the air was still. 3 chimes. The ritual had begun. Mara stepped forward, kneeling before the cradle. Elisna stood beside her, looking not at the tree, but at the sky. Her mother whispered, voice shaking, "I'll see you again." Elisna didn't reply, only held out the ribbon in her hand. Her mother tied it into her hair each morning since she was old enough to walk. Tonight, her hair was unbraided. The ribbon was loose. Then As tradition dictated, she turned her back and walked away. The priest gestured to the two elders. Their faces were painted red with berry paste. Their hands trembled as they guided the girl into the cradle. The ground was cold. Elizna lay on her back. She stared upward as the roots of the elder tree curled above her like fingers. The priest knelt and smeared sap across her forehead. Then the elders began to cover her, gently, slowly, with soil. The crowd did not cry. That too was forbidden. Only Mara trembled, back turned, fists clenched so tightly her nails drew blood. With each handful of dirt, Elizna blinked once, twice. She didn't resist. She only hummed softly the lullaby her mother once sang by the fire. The wind caught her voice. The trees leaned in. And when the last handful of soil pressed down on her chest, the forest exhaled. The priest stepped back. The bell rang once more. Final. The villagers returned to their homes, one by one, quietly. The bending was complete. That night, the crocs rustled as if in approval. The river ran clear again. A stillness returned to the air. But Mara did not sleep. She sat beside her hearth, staring at the empty chair where her daughter once braided dolls from twine and pine needles. Her hands were stained with ribbon dye, her heart with something darker. Outside, the forest sighed, but the elder root said nothing. Deep beneath its roots, the girl dreamed. And somewhere between the soil and the soul, the land began to change. The winters had not been kind to Mara. Her hair, once thick and black as wet soil, had turned the color of ash. Her hands curled now, knotted and gnarled like the roots that surrounded her home. Time had not stolen her beauty. It had carved it into something sorrowful, something hollow. She still lived in the same cottage, still lit the same hearth, still kept the same ribbon, Elisna's ribbon, curled like a dried petal in a wooden box beside her bed. Every year, on the night of the bending's anniversary, she would take it out, press it against her lips, and whisper into the cloth, "Sleep well, my heart." The village believed she had made peace with her loss, but grief does not settle. It coils, it seeps, and sometimes it waits. Mara waited 20 winters. The signs had begun weeks earlier. The animals had grown restless. Chickens pecked their own feathers out. The old horse by the stream refused to drink. Children whispered of dreams filled with trees that bent like women and mouths that opened in bark. Mara stopped attending gatherings, stopped speaking to the neighbors. She would walk to the edge of the woods each morning and stand there, silent, unmoving, as though listening for a voice too old to be heard. Until one night, she moved. No one saw her leave her home. She carried no lantern, only a spade, and the ribbon tied around her wrist now, just as her daughter had worn it. The path to the elder root was overgrown, though she'd walked it hundreds of times in her memories. The forest no longer welcomed her. Branches scraped her face, roots reached for her ankles, but she pressed on, breath shallow, lips whispering her daughter's name like a spell against the cold. When she reached the glade, she paused. The tree stood just as it had 20 years ago, unmoving, unchanged, except the bark now bled sap that glistened like tears. The ground above the cradle was untouched, not even moss dared cover it. She knelt. The first strike of the spade hit stone. The second sank deeper. Hours passed. The moon arced above her, cloaked in clouds. Her fingers blistered. Her breath came in sobs. She tore at the soil with bare hands when the shovel failed. Mud packed under her nails, blood mixed with dirt. Then a knock. Soft, hollow. She froze. Not the sound of earth collapsing, not roots cracking. A knock from beneath. Her heart thudded. Once. Twice. Then silence. She dug faster, desperate, frenzied, until her fingers brushed wood. The cradle. It was intact, though no one had built it. No one remembered building it. Yet here it lay, pulsing faintly beneath her touch, like something that still breathed. With shaking hands, she pulled open the cover of pine and woven bark, and there, beneath it, was Ilisna. Not a skeleton, not dust, not bones wrapped in moss, but her daughter. Eyes closed, skin pale and smooth, hair spread like ink across the cradle's lining, as if asleep. She gasped, her legs gave out, she fell to her knees, sobbing. "Ilisna, please," she whispered. She reached in, touched her daughter's cheek, cold, but not dead. Then, eyes opened. Not fully, just a sliver. No whites, no irises, only black, infinite, rootless. Ilisna blinked once, slowly, then turned her head to her mother. Mara screamed, not from fear, from the sudden, overwhelming weight of hope. She pulled the girl from the cradle, cradled her body against her chest. Ilisna did not resist, but she did not speak, did not move. Her fingers dangled limp, stained with dark sap. Mara whispered lullabies through tears. Words cracked from her throat like breaking ice. She kissed her daughter's forehead, rocked her gently, told her everything would be all right. The forest listened and did not speak. Mara brought her daughter home under the cloak of darkness. No one saw. No one dared be out when the woods breathed like that, hot and sour, like something had been disturbed. She laid her daughter in her old bed, cleaned her limbs with warm water, combed her hair until the tangles were gone. The girl did not blink, did not sleep, only stared at the ceiling, unblinking, mouth slightly open like she was dreaming with her eyes. In the morning, the crops had blackened. Every stalk of wheat, every bulb of garlic, every herb, root, and vine had rotted in place. The air stank of wet earth and burnt leaves. Villagers muttered prayers under their breath. By nightfall, a shepherd stumbled through the village square, blood leaking from his mouth. He collapsed. When they opened his lips, they found pine needles embedded in his tongue. Children began waking in the night, eyes wide, chanting in languages no one remembered. And in Mara's home, Ilisna began to hum, a low vibrating sound, not a song, not a tune, just vibration, like the forest itself was breathing through her. Mara held her hand, sat by her bed, smiled through her terror. She whispered, "I knew you were still in there." Ilisna's eyes turned to her, black and slow. Her mouth opened, and from within, a breath of wind escaped, thick with the scent of bark and something ancient. It was not a word, not a whisper, but Mara understood. She smiled through the tears on her cracked lips and said, I'll keep you safe." That night, a fog rolled in, thick as wool, silent as guilt. Villagers found dead birds on their doorsteps. Dogs refused to bark. Fires wouldn't catch. The priest dreamed of roots twisting through his body, sprouting from his spine, threading through his ribs, blooming through his mouth. He woke coughing blood and the taste of sap. Children stood at the edge of the forest again, eyes blank, fingers twitching. And deep beneath the elder root, the soil began to heave, as though something below was shifting, not waking, but stretching. In the morning, Mara braided her daughter's hair. Ilisna did not blink, but her mouth curved just slightly at the edges. Outside, the wind carried whispers, and in every home, something creaked that never creaked before.
It began with the bees. 3 hives stood on the edge of the southern fields, their honey long praised for its golden richness. But one morning, the villagers found them silent. The bees lay dead in neat spirals around the hives, wings spread, legs curled inward, their tiny bodies coated in pale green mold. No one touched them. By afternoon, the mold had spread to the nearby cabbages. That night the fog returned, thicker, wetter, the kind that crawled beneath doors. A hush fell over the village, not peaceful but expectant, like the world was holding its breath. And then the sleeping began. The first to fall was Annalyn, the blacksmith's boy. His mother found him sitting upright in bed, eyes closed, arms folded across his chest, as though he'd tucked himself into death. He would not wake, he would not eat. His body was warm, breathing shallow, but unreachable. By dawn, 3 more children had succumbed. By noon, it was 7. All the same, asleep, unshaking, unmoving, and humming, faintly as if some sound whispered just beyond hearing. The villagers gathered in the square. Mothers sobbed into their shawls. Fathers gripped pitchforks and muttered blame. The soil's gone sour. Someone's broken the pact. The priest has grown too weak. The trees remember. No one spoke of Mara. Not yet. But eyes began to shift. In her cottage, Mara hummed softly as she stirred the broth. Elesna sat by the window, head tilted. She hadn't spoken, not truly, but her mouth moved sometimes, as though repeating words from another world. Her skin had changed, pale, but threaded now with faint greenish veins, like vines beneath parchment. She stared out at the forest with a kind of longing, not fear, not even wonder, just hunger. That evening, Mara heard scratching at the door. She opened it slowly. A child stood there, barefoot, shivering, eyes closed. Tovrin, the baker's youngest. He swayed on his feet, mouth half open, whispering a broken lullaby, something about trees and teeth. He reached out his hands toward Elesna, who stood behind Mara in the shadows. Mara stepped between them. "No," she said. Her voice cracked with guilt. The child paused, tilted his head, then turned and walked away, not back to his home, but into the fog, toward the forest. Mara called his name once. He didn't turn. The next morning, the village awoke to whispers scratched into wood. Every door, every shutter, every fence post, all carved with the same strange lines, spirals, teeth, roots that curled like tongues. The priest stood at the center of the village square, robes soaking in dew. His face was pale, his hands trembled. He held up the Book of Rites, its pages soaked with sap.
"The forest speaks," he rasped. "We are not listening." Then he collapsed, coughing violently. A pine needle slipped from his mouth, slick and green. Inside her home, Mara began boarding the windows. She had not slept. Elesna still sat at the window, unmoving. At night, her body grew warmer, like something pulsing inside her, like roots twisting into a deeper rhythm. She did not eat, did not blink, only hummed that low, dreadful sound that made the floorboards vibrate. Mara sang lullabies to drown it out, but Elesna always hummed louder. A new sickness bloomed, not just sleep now, but speaking. The awake began speaking words they didn't know. In the tavern, a man rose from his chair, eyes unfocused, and began chanting in a voice not his own. "Bend the bones and drink the roots, sleep beneath, become the wound." Then he sat down, silent, his mouth bleeding sap. Another woman carved symbols into her own thigh, spiral after spiral. When they pulled the knife from her hand, she wept, not from pain, but from remembrance. "I heard her, the girl beneath the tree. She said we forgot." By now, 11 children had fallen into the deep sleep. 3 had vanished entirely. The village well ran dark for a day and a half, then returned, tasting faintly of ash. And in the woods, something moved. The trees leaned in unnatural directions, branches twisted like antlers. Roots shifted in patterns no wind could explain. At night, the forest breathed louder than before, and the villagers began to fear what might crawl out of it next. Mara sat at the edge of her bed, her face hollow. She no longer prayed. What god would listen now? She stared at Elesna, who lay across the floor, body arched unnaturally, eyes closed but glowing faintly beneath the lids. Her skin had split at the fingertips, tiny cracks from which sap oozed, thick and slow. Still, Mara held her hand. Still, she whispered, "I love you. I love you. I love you." But the girl only hummed. One night, Mara dreamed of roots. They burst through her walls, wrapped around her ankles, pulled her through the floor and down, down, into the dirt, past bones and cradles and screaming mouths, until she reached a hollow chamber. There, dozens of girls sat in rows, some crying, some laughing, some silent. All had Elesna's face. All stared at her. And from their mouths came a single word, spoken in perfect unison. "You broke the pact." Mara awoke with a scream in her throat and sap on her sheets. The villagers could no longer pretend. They gathered again in the square, though fewer now. Some had fled, others simply vanished. The priest did not speak. He only burned the Book of Rites. But as the flames rose, a scream echoed from the woods, long and high, the voice of a child. Then silence. Then laughter. Not joy, mockery. And the trees began to creak. That night, Elesna opened her eyes, and for the first time, she smiled. Mara wept. And outside, the trees began to whisper. The whispers came first. They slipped in through the cracks in the walls, through the thin seams of doors, through the gaps between teeth. Soft at first, like wind threading through pine, then sharper, louder, intentional. They were not in any known tongue, but every villager who heard them understood deep in the marrow that they were meant to be remembered. Not spoken, not written, remembered.
Tomas had once been the eldest of the village council, a man of clear rules and measured thoughts. But now he wandered barefoot through the fields, muttering fragments of names no one recognized. On the 5th day of the sickness, he woke from sleep with his bed soaked in ink-black sap, his tongue swollen and split in two, not down the middle, but sideways, like a worm bisected. He couldn't speak anymore, but he could still write. He took chalk and began scribbling on every surface he could find, on fence posts, on floors, on the walls of the meeting hall, on his own skin. Symbols, spirals, the old language, though he had never learned it. A child followed him, copying each mark in silence. Another joined, and another. Soon the village was covered in ink and ash, symbols layered over doors like seals or invitations. And then came the dreams. The villagers who hadn't succumbed to the sleeping sickness began to suffer night terrors. They all dreamt of the same thing, a massive tree with roots like ribs and a hollow at its center. And in the hollow, a girl, not one, but many, dozens, hundreds, all with blank eyes, all with mouths stitched shut by pine needles and twine. Yet still they screamed, soundless, writhing, their agony echoing through the soil itself. When the dreamers awoke, they could taste sap in their throats. One man choked until a small twig snapped from between his teeth. Another found the soles of his feet stained black, as though he'd walked barefoot through burnt soil. One woman went blind overnight, not from illness. Her eyes had grown shut, layers of thin bark sealing them closed. She whispered before vanishing, "She's teaching them the old tongue, so they remember what we forgot." In her cottage, Mara stood at the threshold of her daughter's room, clutching the doorframe until her knuckles turned white. Ilisna no longer looked like a child. Her eyes, when open, glowed with a sheen like dew on moss. Her fingers had lengthened unnaturally. Her limbs had grown thin, stretched, joints where they shouldn't be. Her skin shimmered with a subtle pattern like bark beneath flesh. And her mouth no longer moved like a human's. It trembled, twitched, pulled into shapes that mimicked words not meant for sound. She spoke, but only in dreams. Mara's sleep grew thinner each night, and when it came, so did the voice. Not from her own mind, not from memory, but from Ilisna. She would stand at the foot of her mother's bed in the dreams, wearing her burial ribbon like a crown. Her feet left muddy prints on the wood floor, though everything else remained untouched. And she would say, in a voice layered, echoing, too wide for a child's throat, "We bore your grief, we drank your winter, we held your hunger, you buried us in silence, and still we sang." Then her mouth would open wider, wider, until it split her face. And Mara would wake choking, fists clenched around a fistful of pine needles she had no memory of holding. In the village, the priest no longer led services. He had barricaded himself in the old chapel, covering every wall in sigils, binding the altar with human hair and sap-stained rope. He was heard shouting, "She is not a spirit, she is not a ghost, she is the sorrow we planted." No one dared enter. Until one morning, smoke rose from the chapel's chimney. They found him curled in the center of the room, still breathing, but silent. His tongue had been removed. It lay on the altar, wrapped in a child's burial ribbon. More children began speaking in tongues, not always aloud. Some wrote messages in the dirt with sticks, others carved shapes into trees using only their fingernails. One child drew a picture of the village, surrounded by tall, misshapen trees. Each house bore a symbol. Each symbol matched the mark etched into their doors weeks ago. At the center of the village, she had drawn a tree with no branches, only a mouth, wide open, devouring the sun. When asked what it was, she said, "That's the elder root after she wakes." Mara no longer left the house. The villagers knew. They had seen Elisna at the window. They had heard the humming through the walls, but none dared confront her. Not yet, because some still remember the last time the pact was broken. Some still remember what happened when the forest grew hungry. One night, the fog returned, heavier than ever. It swallowed sound, it devoured light. And with it came the voices. They did not rise from the woods. They rose from underneath, from under homes, from under floors, from under the very earth. Mothers woke to find their babies humming in unison. Elders awoke mid-sentence, speaking in voices long dead. One girl stood in her bed and shouted, "We are the soil's sorrow. We are the harvest of grief." Then collapsed. Her mouth was full of moss. Mara sat beside Elisna, brushing her hair with slow, deliberate strokes. The ribbon still clung to her daughter's wrist, though it had turned brittle, frayed and faded, like it had been underground far longer than 20 years. Elisna blinked, and in her blink the walls of the cottage breathed. A gust of wind moved through the closed room. Mara didn't flinch. She only whispered, "They never loved you like I did. That's why they left you there. That's why I brought you back." But Elisna did not answer. She only smiled, and her mouth split a little more. At dawn, the villagers found Tomas's house empty. Only the symbols remained, pulsing faintly beneath the paint, as if burned into the wood itself. Above the door, carved in deep, unshakable grooves, were the words, "The roots remember, but the tongues must return."
Long before the village was swallowed by pine, long before the first cradle was carved into the earth, there were the starving years. They spoke of them only in hushed stories, tales half withered by time and fear. Stories of a winter that stretched for 3 years, of sky that refused to snow but never stopped groaning, of crops that sprouted with blight, of livestock that birthed still and silent, of mothers who held their children over empty soup pots, whispering lullabies while chewing on roots and wood. And then, of the voice that came from the forest. Not a god, not a devil, something older, something hungry. It came first in the dreams of the dying, in a place between sleep and soil. A girl with no mouth, a body of bark, eyes full of black water. She whispered without lips, "Give me sorrow, and I will feed you life." The elders gathered, desperate and hollowed, and followed the voice into the woods. They walked beneath the leaning trees until they came upon the clearing, where no bird sang and no insect stirred. There they found the elder root, a massive tree unlike any other. Its bark was soft, its scent was sweet, its roots pulsed with heat. At its base, a hollow,
and in that hollow, a bundle of bones wrapped in a child's shift, still warm. The oldest among them fell to her knees and wept. The first bending came 3 nights later. They did not call it that yet. Back then, they called it the offering. They chose a girl, not orphaned, not unloved, a daughter born beneath the eclipse, said to carry sorrow in her breath. Her name was lost, but her story was carved in the old stones, now buried beneath vines and forgetting. They laid her in the hollow beneath the elder root. They did not kill her. They only placed her there, alive, eyes wide, breathing slow. And as they covered her with soil, they heard it. Not a scream, not a cry, a song, soft, wordless, carried through the branches like fog. The very next morning, the frost thawed. The fields, once dead, now shimmered green. Goats birthed healthy twins. The river flowed again, deeper and clearer than ever before. And from that moment on, they owed the forest, not in fear, but in gratitude. The pact was not written. It did not need to be. Every 7 years, a daughter would be chosen, not sacrificed, not killed, bent. Bent into the soil, bent into sorrow, bent so the land would bloom. She would not die, they believed, not truly. She would sleep, absorb, hold the village's grief so their children would never have to. They said the girls became part of the forest. Their sorrow fed the roots. Their silence soaked the soil. But the girls never returned. And that, the elders said, was the price of peace. Over time, the bending became ritual, sacred, a holy thing. The villagers would gather in silence. The girl would be chosen not for her weakness, but for her strength. She would be honored, adorned in ribbons and pine crowns, guided to the elder root with song and sorrow. Each time the harvest after was bountiful. Each time the winters were kinder. And so the pact held, until one year a mother said no. Her name was Valea. She had lost 2 sons to the fever. Only her daughter remained, Isrin. When the elders knocked at her door and said the child had been chosen, Valea did not open it. She barred the windows, hid Isrin beneath the floorboards, refused the forest its due. That winter, the river froze black. The soil turned to dust. Children starved in their sleep. And the dreams returned, worse than before. This time the villagers dreamed of eyes opening beneath the earth, of mouths filled with soil, of limbs twisting into roots, unable to scream. One man tore out his own tongue after dreaming for 7 nights in a row. Another drowned himself in the well, leaving a note scratched into wood. She waits beneath. She has not forgiven. The villagers stormed Valea's home. They dragged Isrin from the floor, kicking and sobbing. The ritual that year was not quiet. It was not reverent. It was desperate, angry. They buried the child under the elder root without prayer, without song. And when they returned home, a baby had died in its crib, lungs filled with sap. From that year on, the pact was kept with strict devotion. The priesthood was formed. The book of rites was carved. The rule was clear: 1 daughter every 7 years, without fail. Those who resisted were cast out. Those who forgot were buried beside them. But the fear was no longer of hunger or frost. It was of what they had buried and what it had become. Now, 20 winters later, the pact was broken again by Mara, and the girl who had been meant to hold sorrow had brought it back with her, changed, rooted, blooming with rot. The children who slept now hummed in the same tones as the forest wind. The soil, once rich, now bled worms that writhed in spirals. The roots of the elder tree twisted outward, inching toward the village like seeking hands. And no one dared to say it aloud, but all knew the pact had not simply been broken, it had been betrayed. And the forest does not forget betrayal. In her cottage, Mara opened the old wooden box where she kept relics from Elisna's childhood. A doll made of straw, a thimble, a tiny pine cone necklace, all now coated in a thin layer of moss. Even the past had begun to rot. Elisna sat on the floor, humming softly, mouth moving in slow, unfamiliar shapes. Her fingers twisted thread into spirals, her eyes closed, head tilted to the side, like listening to a voice only she could hear. And when Mara whispered, "What are you hearing?" Elisna replied in a voice not her own, "They are waking up. I hear the ones who came before me." That night the wind carried new sounds. Not whispers, laughter, high, childlike, but wrong. Dozens of voices laughing from beneath the ground. In the center of the village, the statue of the first priest cracked down the center. Inside, buried in the stone, was a single bone, small and smooth, a child's rib, wrapped in a ribbon. The next bending was still 2 years away, but the forest no longer seemed to be willing to wait. It had fed them. Now it had come to collect.
They say the forest never sleeps, but now it had begun to breathe. Not the quiet rustle of pine needles, not the gentle shifting of branches in wind, but something deeper, a rhythmic heaving in the roots, a pulse that traveled through the soles of feet into the hollow of the spine. It came from beneath the elder root, and it was growing louder. Marin, the trapper, was the first to speak of it. He had gone into the woods before dawn, hoping to check his snares before the fog returned. But the moment he passed beyond the first tree line, he felt it, like stepping onto living flesh. The ground was warm, wet, and when he looked down, he saw that his boots had sunken half an inch into soft, black soil that bled red when disturbed. Still, he pressed on. He never returned. That night, the fog didn't roll in. It rose. It spilled from the forest floor like steam from a cracked mouth, thick and low, pouring into the village with a sour metallic scent. Dogs howled once, then went silent. Chickens scattered their feathers without making a sound. The villagers woke, choking on air that no longer belonged to them. And when they opened their doors, they saw something new. The trees had moved. Not all, but enough. Their trunks leaned closer now, arched toward the homes like eavesdropping giants. Bark split in places it hadn't before. Thin vertical slits,
like old scars or closed eyes. And beneath the elder root, the earth had sagged. A dent, a sinkhole, a slight folding inward, as if something beneath was turning over in its sleep. In the chapel, the priest sat with no tongue, his body covered in script written by children in the night. He pointed to the altar with a trembling finger. There, laid carefully atop the old cloth, was a dead robin. Its wings were gone, its beak sealed with wax. Beneath it, scrawled in ash, "She is not hungry, she is opening." The children who had fallen into sleep now twitched in unison. Their bodies remained still, but their fingers curled at the same rhythm. 5 slow clenches, then release, over and over, as though mimicking something reaching. One mother tried to wake her son. She screamed into his ear, slapped his face. He did not stir, but the floorboards beneath his bed cracked from the inside. They dragged him outside and laid him on the frozen grass. By morning, he was gone. Only a shallow hole remained, carved straight down, filled with black needles and twisted bits of cloth. The villagers said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Mara sat in silence. Her cottage now bloomed with mold. Moss crept along the corners of the ceiling. Tiny mushrooms sprouted from the wooden table legs. The air smelled like damp memory. She no longer resisted it. Elisna had stopped humming. Now, she whispered, not in words, in sound. A low clicking, like tree branches tapping against glass, or bones dropped into a hollow bowl. At night, Mara dreamed of roots wrapping around her daughter's ribs, threading through her spine, pressing gently into her throat, not to choke, but to fill her. And in the dream, Elisna turned and opened her mouth. Inside, not a tongue, not teeth, a tunnel, lined with pine needles, and it breathed. The hunter, Galen, claimed he saw something move beneath the elder root. He had gone to watch it, armed with a blade dipped in pitch and a prayer he no longer believed in. He said he saw the soil ripple, like a lung, like a birthing, like the earth was struggling to hold something that wanted to rise. And then the bark split, not in a break, in a smile, a curved crack across the trunk of the elder root, wide and wet. It opened slowly, groaning, and within, darkness, but not empty. He said it looked back at him. That night, Galen's body was found outside the village gate. His skin had turned gray, not rotted, but stiff, like tree bark. His eyes were open, his hands clenched into fists, and when they pried his fingers apart, they found what he had tried to hold in his final moment. A single tooth, not human, not animal, wooden, still bleeding. The whispers changed after that. No longer just in dreams, now they lived in the walls. Villagers heard murmurs behind them, under their beds, inside the seams of their clothes. Children began speaking to people no one could see, laughing, playing, then suddenly screaming and clawing at their own faces. One girl carved a hole in her bedroom floor and slept inside it, curled up like a seed. Another refused to wear shoes, said she could feel her sisters breathing under the roots. And in every home, things began to vanish. Food, salt, firewood, but always ribbons. Every scrap, every bow, every leftover piece from bending seasons past, gone, as if something was gathering them, preparing. Mara watched her daughter sleep, if it could still be called that. Her chest did not rise and fall like a child's. Her breath moved through her differently now, deeper, slower, more like the creaking of old wood. The veins in her arms had turned dark. From her feet, tiny green shoots had begun to sprout, curling around the blanket, pushing into the floorboards. Still, Mara did not cry. She only whispered, "You're not gone. You're just becoming." Elisna opened her eyes and smiled. That same night, the elder root groaned, not creaked, not swayed, groaned, as if something beneath it was no longer content to stay hidden. The next morning, a child walked into the village square, covered in dirt, eyes blank. He spoke in a voice that echoed, not like shouting, but like the sound had been spoken underground and was only now reaching the surface. He said, "She has grown teeth, she has opened her mouth, and now she waits." Then he dropped to the ground, and from his mouth spilled pine needles, soaked in blood. By dusk, no birds remained. The sky turned a deep brown green, and the sun flickered behind clouds that did not move. And beneath the elder root, a second smile split open, wider, waiting.
It began with coughing, not the kind brought by sickness, nor the dry rasp of winter's cold. This cough was sharp, splintered, wet. It echoed through the village one morning, erupting from the mouth of Rewin, the miller's son, strong, healthy, unafraid. He staggered into the square, clutching his chest, and fell to his knees. When he opened his mouth, blood spilled onto the ground, but not just blood. Pine needles, long, green and fresh, slick with sap. They spilled from his throat like a bouquet torn from the inside. Rewin collapsed, dead, and carved across his back in scratches that had not been there before were words, "Blood that turns its back will bleed from the root." The villagers said nothing at first, but they all remembered. Rewin had refused to attend the last bending, had called it barbaric, had spat in front of the elder root, and now the forest had answered. Later that day, Emra, who had left the village for 10 years and only recently returned, was found sobbing behind her home. Her mouth was sealed shut with twine, her fingers bloodied from trying to tear it away. When the priest, still tongueless, still trembling, saw her, he pointed to the forest. Then he drew a spiral across his chest and held up 3 fingers. 3 betrayals, 3 signs, 3 names. The whispers came sharper now, not in riddles, not in forgotten lullabies, but in accusation. You let her rot.
You turned your back. You broke the pact. The village, once silent in fear, now boiled in blame. Mothers pointed at daughters who had spoken against the bending. Elders turned on neighbors who had missed ceremonies. Old quarrels resurfaced, debts unpaid, curses unspoken, betrayals long buried. Someone threw a stone through Mara's window. Another painted a red spiral across her door. They began gathering in the square at night, not to pray, but to confess. In terrified voices, villagers admitted to things they had never dared speak aloud. I lied during the choosing. I swapped the name in the bowl. I helped a girl escape before the bending. One by one, they wept, and the forest listened. Then came the deaths, but not like before. Now they were targeted. Hedra, who had faked her fertility to avoid offering a daughter, was found hanging by her ankles from a tree just outside the village, her mouth stuffed with torn cloth. Her last words had been stitched into her dress with hair. I was not enough. Tarn, who helped burn the Book of Rites, died choking on ash, with symbols scorched across his chest, burned from the inside. No one buried them. The bodies were left where they fell. Because the forest had begun to mark who was claimed and who would rot if touched. Meanwhile, Elisna no longer slept. She sat at the center of the cottage floor, back straight, eyes closed. Her skin had darkened, not with death, but with growth. Bark-like ridges now traced along her shoulders. Veins beneath her skin pulsed with green. The floor beneath her had softened, as if the roots below had risen to cradle her from beneath. Mara sat by her side, hands folded, eyes sunken. She spoke less now. She had begun to dream of Elisna's mouth, opening wider each time, revealing not teeth, but roots, knotted, wet, and whispering. That night, 3 villagers approached her door. They wore red around their necks, ribbon remnants from past bendings, and carried torches, though the flames flickered in unnatural winds. They knocked once, then again. Mara did not answer. A voice called through the wood, "You broke the pact. The land bleeds. You must give her back." Mara rose slowly. Her joints ached. Her fingers trembled. She opened the door. The wind howled. The torches died instantly. And Elisna stood behind her, now taller, her eyes wide, her mouth parting slowly. The 3 villagers fell to their knees. One vomited needles. The second began speaking in reverse. The third simply wept, her tears running black. Mara shut the door. No one returned the next day to take the bodies. Across the village, a new fear took root. What if the forest no longer wanted forgiveness? What if it now wanted balance? For every girl buried, a life had been spared. Now it seemed the debt was being collected, not in crops, not in song, but in blood, and only blood. In the schoolhouse, children had stopped drawing with chalk. They now carved into the desks with sharpened pine splinters. Crude images of mouths growing from trees, of villagers being pulled underground, of roots wrapping around hearts. And always, always, the spiral, drawn over and over until the wood cracked. One teacher, in desperation, tried to erase the carvings. She was found 2 days later in her home, her fingernails torn off, her tongue nailed to the underside of her desk, spiral burned into her back with candle soot. No one claimed her body. No one said her name. They began whispering about the breaking, a word that hadn't been spoken in generations, not when a bending failed, but when the pact had been shattered completely. It was said the breaking would come with teeth, with roots that drank blood instead of sorrow, with trees that walked, with a harvest of flesh. That night, Mara placed her hand on her daughter's chest. She whispered, voice trembling, "They want you, but they don't know you've already changed. They don't know you were never meant to come back." Elisna opened her eyes and said, clearly for the first time, "Then show them." The next morning, the elder roots split, not in a crack, in a mouth. The spiral at its base began to rotate slowly, not physically, but visually, as if the eyes could no longer trust the shape they saw. And from the hollow below, something crawled. Something with skin like wet bark, eyes like moss, and a face that had once belonged to a girl from a long time ago. She smiled, and she whispered in dozens of voices, "One for every daughter you buried, one for every truth you silenced." The trees began to sway, and the village finally understood. This was not a haunting. This was a reckoning.
The village stopped sleeping, or rather, it stopped trusting sleep. Those who dared close their eyes found themselves pulled into a realm that was not their own, a dreamscape stitched together with roots, grief, and old blood. It was not rest, it was an invitation. In the first days, the dreams came in fragments. A cradle buried in soil, a ribbon floating in black water, 1,000 eyes opening beneath the bark of trees. But by the end of the week, the dreams became shared. Different villagers, strangers, families, even children awoke speaking the same phrases, reciting the same symbols, drawing the same image again and again. A girl with no face, her mouth stretched wide, filled with soil, and from her mouth roots, reaching, pulling, teaching. In these dreams, Elisana appeared, not as she was, not as the girl who once laughed by the hearth or plucked daisies in the spring, but as something becoming. She stood taller than before, her skin no longer smooth but veined with living wood. Moss grew along her collarbone. Her voice echoed, not just once, but twice with every word, as if something beneath her skin was speaking alongside her. She did not scream. She did not threaten. She simply said, "You gave us silence. Now we give you memory." And then the roots came. The villagers began waking in sweat and sap. Their ears bled, their limbs spasmed. One man tore the flesh from his own arms, screaming that the tree inside him wouldn't stop growing. They tried to burn their beds. They tried to stay awake, but the sleep always came, and when it did, Elisana was waiting. Mara no longer dreamed, or perhaps she had learned to live inside the dream.
She could feel the pull of it now, a hum beneath her feet, a whisper in her breath. The world outside had grown dim, like a room lit only by candlelight. Her daughter no longer spoke out loud, but when Mara closed her eyes, she heard her, clear, calm. "They are remembering, Mother. I am not alone anymore. The others are waking." Indeed, the village had begun to change. Children sleepwalked into the forest, returning hours later with bark on their hands and pine cones in their mouths. They could not recall what they had done, but when they touched paper, they drew the same thing, a spiral wrapped in roots, and at the center, a face, Elizana's. In the chapel, what remained of the priest had withered. He sat unmoving in the pews, sap trailing from his eyes like tears. His body was fused to the wood now, bark growing from his spine, rooting him to the holy bench like he'd become part of the furniture. Some believed he was dead. Others whispered he had become the listener, the one who absorbed the voices and whispered them back in dreams. No one entered the chapel anymore. It breathed. Then, one by one, the villagers began speaking in sleep. It started with muttering, then humming, then full sentences. "She remembers. She is beneath us. We are inside her now." Some began walking while asleep, carving spirals into their own doors or placing offerings of teeth and twine at the base of trees. They were not possessed, not cursed. They were being taught. The village healer, Senna, tried to stop it. She brewed herbs to prevent dreams. She stitched protective talismans into clothes. She hung dried bones around her windows. But she too began to speak at night. Her husband woke to find her sitting upright in bed, eyes wide, mouth unmoving, yet a voice spilled from her lips. "We do not seek revenge. We seek return. Return to root. Return to grief. Return to us." The next morning, Senna's throat was full of needles. She could no longer speak. Mara, meanwhile, knelt beside Elizana each day. Her daughter's body had grown strange, longer than a child's. Her limbs curled in gentle spirals. Faint blossoms bloomed across her cheeks. Her eyes no longer blinked. They watched. They absorbed. And when Mara laid her head against her daughter's chest, she could hear them. The voices beneath the soil. Hundreds, thousands, girls lost to time, singing in silence. They had never died. They had simply waited. Then the forest began to move, not in rustles, but in footsteps. Villagers awoke to find trees in new places. A massive pine stood suddenly beside the well. Another pressed up against a house that once faced an open path. The forest was drawing closer, every night another inch. And under the elder root, the mouth yawned wider. If you leaned close enough, you could hear it breathing. And if you closed your eyes, you could hear her voice. In the dream, Elizana stood at the center of the village, not in flesh, but in something older, twisted, regal. Her limbs were crowned with moss. Her voice moved through trees, through soil, through blood. She said, "You gave your daughters to the earth, but never listened to what they became." And as she spoke, the houses collapsed, not with fire, not with wind, but with roots, bursting through floorboards, wrapping around beams, pulling walls inward like rib cages closing. And then the village was gone, replaced with a forest, tall, silent, full of spirals. Mara awoke in tears, not of fear, but of knowing. She had been shown the future, and she had not wept because it was terrifying. She had wept because it was true. That morning, a boy wandered into the village from the forest. He had been missing for days. He did not speak. He only held out his hands, which were cupped. Inside them, soil, wriggling with roots, and buried within it, a human eye, still blinking, still wet, still awake.
They began returning in the second week. The children who had vanished, drawn into the forest during sleep, one by one, barefoot and humming, were suddenly back. They appeared at the edge of the village at dawn, standing in rows, hands by their sides, clothes damp with dew and soil caked beneath their fingernails. Their eyes were open, but nothing looked out from them. At first, the villagers wept. Mothers rushed to hold them. Fathers fell to their knees. The air shook with cries of reunion. But when the children were embraced, they did not respond. They did not blink, did not speak, did not smile. Their bodies were warm, but their souls had gone somewhere else. They sat in silence wherever they were placed, on beds, on benches, on bare earth, always upright, always still. And then, at midnight, they would rise together and walk. One by one, they made their way to the center of the village square. There they sat in a perfect circle, backs straight, hands folded, eyes wide. They said nothing, but they moved their mouths as though reciting something in unison, though no sound came out. The villagers watched from behind shutters and doorways, too afraid to interrupt. And just before dawn, the children would return to their places, like dolls set back on a shelf. The healer, Senna, tried to examine one. She took the youngest girl, barely 4 winters old, into her home, laid her on a table, checked her pulse, strong, checked her breath, steady. But when Senna opened the girl's mouth, she found her tongue had turned black. Not rotten, not dead, black, like soil soaked in ash. And along the roof of her mouth, tiny roots had begun to grow, curling like veins, soft and wet. Senna stepped back. The child sat up and whispered in a voice that was not hers, "We are not theirs anymore." The village changed after that. People no longer smiled at the returned children. They fed them, bathed them, dressed them, but no one tried to speak to them anymore, because they knew these were not children returned, they were messages. Elisna hummed when the children walked, not loudly, not joyfully. She hummed like a mother rocking a cradle carved from bones. She no longer ate. Her limbs stretched further each day, fingers like sprigs of birch, hair now thick with moss. Bark had begun to split through the skin of her back like a second spine, and where she walked, the floor softened, as if the forest was beneath the house and rising to meet her. Mara no longer tried to stop it. She swept the dirt that crept in under the door. She changed her daughter's clothes when they grew tight around her blooming body. She whispered lullabies, even when Elisna hummed over them. Strange songs,
songs with no melody, only rhythm, the rhythm of growing things. Then on the seventh night, something new happened. The hollow children returned to the square as always, sat as always, mouthed the silent chants as always, but this time they dug with their fingers. Silently, slowly, methodically, they scraped at the packed earth with bare hands. Not deep, just enough to loosen the top layer. And when they were done, they stood, and each child reached into the hole they'd made and pulled out a ribbon. Some red, some blue, some brown and frayed with age, all faded, all burial ribbons, remnants of the girls who had been bent long ago. They held them to their chests like relics, then turned and walked into the forest. The villagers watched in silence. No one followed. But in the morning, when the brave went to the square, they found more ribbons, dozens, hundreds, tied to every post, wound around tree trunks, tucked into door handles, stuffed beneath pillows. The forest had returned what had once been forgotten. It had brought back the names. The old woman, Drella, who had once been a midwife to the choosing, woke with a ribbon around her throat. She stumbled into the street, choking, clawing at the knot, unable to breathe. She collapsed, dead. And etched in the ribbon, not stitched, not inked, but grown, were 3 words: "You chose wrongly." More villagers began confessing, to no one, to the trees, to the wind. I looked away when she begged me. I said her name out of jealousy. I knew she wasn't ready. They wept. But the forest does not forgive tears, only roots. In her sleep, Mara dreamed of the hollow children marching in lines, leading Elisna through the woods, crowning her in pine, bowing to her shadow. And Elisna stood among the trees, tall and twisted, vines blooming from her eyes, her body half bark, half blood. And she said, without moving her lips, "The ones you buried are no longer asleep. The soil has remembered, and so have they." When Mara woke, Elisna was gone. Only damp footprints remained. They led out the door, down the steps, toward the square, and Mara followed. In the center of the village, the hollow children stood in a circle again, but this time they were not alone. Elisna stood in the middle, her head tilted upward, eyes closed, mouth slightly open. And as Mara approached, she saw it. Something was growing from her daughter's mouth. A small branch, thin, delicate, but real. It twisted upward, bark slick, buds just beginning to bloom. And as the sun rose, the children opened their mouths together, and from each one a single word echoed: "Remember." Mara fell to her knees, not in fear, in awe, because for the first time in 20 years, she understood. This was not about revenge, not about punishment, not even about grief. This was about memory, what had been buried, what had been forgotten, and now what was growing in its place.
At first, no one heard the sound. It was too low, too steady, like the murmur of wind through hollow bones. But soon it grew. By the 3rd night, it became unmistakable, a song, not sung with voices, not with lips or breath. It came from throats that had long since stopped speaking, from mouths stitched shut by regret, from tongues long swallowed by soil, and yet they sang. It began in the woods,
Those who dared approach the edge, brave or foolish, spoke of a low vibration in the air, one that passed through the chest before reaching the ears. It trembled through the trees like a warning or a welcoming. Then, on the fourth night, the sound reached the village, not loud, but relentless. The children, the hollow ones, were the first to respond. They stood at once, walked to the village square again, forming the same circle. But this time, they opened their mouths. And though no notes escaped, the sound moved through them. Their chests rose in time with the vibration, their heads tilted as though listening from within. And then, in perfect unison, they hummed. The villagers tried to block their ears, but the sound was not heard in the usual way. It bypassed bone and skin. It pressed directly into the mind. Even the deaf felt it. Even the dead, some said, stirred beneath the ground. Those who had once cut out their tongues, willingly, in shame or in fear, now began to speak again in dreams, not with words, but with resonance. They hummed in their sleep, their throats swelling unnaturally, as if something inside was being played like a flute carved from grief. Their bodies arched, their lips bled, and in the morning they remembered nothing. But the humming continued. The song had no melody, no harmony. It was a dirge built from the ache of centuries. It spoke of girls buried without names, of rituals spoken through clenched jaws, of lullabies forgotten before they reached the cradle. And it grew louder with each night. Mara heard it in her blood. She woke from her sleep with tears on her face and sap in her hair. Elisna now stood by the window, unmoving, humming with the others. The branch growing from her mouth had bloomed. Small blossoms opened like teeth, pale and pulsing. A strange light glowed faintly from within them, flickering like memory. Mara brushed the moss from her daughter's shoulders and whispered, "I hear you, love, all of you." Elisna turned her head slightly, and for the first time, she nodded. Then came the spiral fire. It began in the sky. A streak of green flame arced above the trees one night, crackling with no sound, trailing smoke shaped like twisting vines. It did not fall. It hovered. And when it vanished, the forest glowed. Tiny lights shimmered in the branches like stars caught in bark. Some said they were spirits. Others said they were the voices made visible. Either way, the trees had begun to watch back. In the morning, the villagers discovered the first spiral fire mark. Etched into the stone of the old well, scorched black into the rock, a perfect spiral wrapped in 7 concentric rings. At its center, a handprint. Small, childlike, still warm. They found more the next day, burned into rooftops, carved into livestock, branded into human skin. None of them could be removed. None of them could be denied. Then the choir began to spread. No longer just the children, now even the trees joined. They groaned in rhythm, bark splitting to exhale wind like breath, leaves trembling in waves. The air itself began to sing. People fell to their knees mid-step, clutching their heads. One man bit through his own tongue, trying to silence the hum within him. Another began to laugh and never stopped until his jaw broke. And in every home, the same refrain echoed. A song that had no words, only longing. In desperation, the last surviving elder, male, called for an offering. He stood in the square with shaking hands and a sacrificial bowl carved from elder wood. He said, "We were wrong to bury only girls. This grief belongs to all of us." And before anyone could stop him, he slit his own throat and fell forward into the bowl. The earth drank his blood, but the choir did not stop. That night, Elisna walked into the square. Not alone. The hollow children followed, but behind them came others, girls, women, figures that shimmered with half-light, skin made of roots and memory, hair trailing mist and ribbons. Some were young, some were old. All were familiar. They were the ones who had been bent. They had come from beneath, and now they stood shoulder to shoulder with Elisna, forming a ring around the children. Together, they opened their mouths, and the song broke into the air. This time, everyone heard it. The villagers fell where they stood, not in pain, but in reverence. The sound moved through their bones, peeling away the lies, the forgettings, the rituals performed without meaning. It sang the truth. We were never taken. We were given, and we became what you feared, not vengeance, but memory you could no longer silence. As the final note trembled through the earth, the village lanterns extinguished themselves. Not from wind, not from rain, from grief. And in the darkness, the forest sang on. By the end of the third week, the village no longer resembled what it once was. The air trembled with unseen song. The trees pressed in close, now standing shoulder to shoulder like ancient judges. And the villagers, thinned, hollowed, forever changed, began to murmur the same word: trial. It began as a whisper, then a suggestion, then a decision, spoken not from authority, but from surrender. The forest would not stop. The children would not speak. The harvest had turned black. The well now tasted of iron. And only one name remained in their mouths: Mara. The mother who had dug where no one was meant to dig. The mother who broke the silence. The mother who brought her child back. They came for her at dusk. No torches, no shouting, just a line of villagers with empty faces, hollow eyes, and trembling hands. They did not bind her. They did not drag her. They only stood there, waiting. And Mara, who had not left her home in days, understood. She rose slowly, wiped the sap from her hands, and kissed Elisna on the forehead, careful not to touch the branch still blooming from her lips. Then she followed. The trial was not held in the chapel. That place was no longer sacred. It was held beneath the elder root, the tree with its wide yawning mouth, still splitting open with impossible patience. The villagers gathered in a loose circle. The hollow children sat at their edges, heads bowed, humming softly, like an audience of ancestors. And Mara stood alone in the center. There were no accusations, no list of charges, only silence. And then a voice, sharp, brittle, afraid, broke the hush. "You brought her back." Mara nodded. Another spoke. "You touched what was meant to sleep." Mara closed her eyes. A third. "You chose love over tradition. You chose yourself." At that, Mara opened her mouth, and her voice was not loud, not angry, but strong, like a river that has run beneath frost for too long. She said, "Yes, I chose love, because love was never part of your rituals. You buried our daughters like offerings, but you never mourned them. You never missed their laughter. You never heard them cry." Silence. Then she stepped forward only once and added, "You called it a pact. I call it cowardice." Gasps. Tears. One woman collapsed to her knees, whispering the name of the daughter she had offered up 28 years ago. But still, the villagers pressed on. This was not just about grief. This was about balance, and the forest had not stopped. Suddenly, the roots of the elder tree began to shift, not slightly, violently. The ground beneath Mara cracked open, not to swallow her, but to reveal. A deep hollow beneath the tree, where dozens of tiny shapes lay, half buried in moss and memory. Ribbons, bones, dolls, tiny shoes, all from the daughters who had been buried. And from the shadows of that hollow, voices began to rise, high, childlike, fractured. "She remembers us. She mourned us. She sang to us." The villagers stepped back. Many began to weep. Some screamed, because the voices were not angry. They were forgiving, not to the village, but to her. Then Elisna arrived. She walked barefoot across the square, her moss-covered dress trailing behind her like a second skin. Her hair had gone completely black, not from color, but from rot and shadow. Branches spiraled from her arms. Tiny blossoms blinked like eyes. She stepped into the circle without fear, her presence forcing the wind to hush. And Mara turned. Mother and daughter faced one another beneath the tree that had once separated them. And for the first time, they spoke without words. Elisna raised her hand, opened her fingers, and from her palm grew a cradle, made of bark and breath. Inside it, a single seed, still wet, still beating. Mara reached out, trembling, touched it, and saw. In a flash that split thought from flesh, Mara remembered every daughter ever buried. She felt their last breaths, heard their final lullabies, carried their cold, silent weight in her arms. And still they sang. We were never meant to be forgotten, only held and planted and named. Mara fell to her knees. The seed pulsed in her hand, and Elisna, no longer child, no longer girl, no longer grief, whispered into her mother's mind, "Then be the root, become the cradle, hold what they would not." Mara smiled, through tears, through pain. She nodded once, and then lay down in the hollow beneath the elder root. Elisna stood above her. The villagers watched in silence. No one moved. And from the soil, roots began to curl upward, slow, gentle, wrapping around Mara's arms, her chest, her face. And as the earth folded back over her, a single flower bloomed from the crown of her head, pale and bright, and Elisna wept. The wind shifted, the trees swayed, and somewhere in the dark, The song finally changed.
The forest was quiet now, but not still. Something had shifted, not in the air, not in the trees, but in the balance between memory and silence. Mara was gone, or perhaps not gone, only planted. Beneath the elder root, the soil had closed gently above her, and in her place, a new branch had grown. Not from the tree, but from the earth itself. Thin, delicate, tipped with a single white bloom. It pulsed with warmth, and it watched. Elisna stood beside it, no longer a girl, no longer the child once cradled in song. She had become something else, not spirit, not ghost, not monster, but memory incarnate. Her limbs bore bark, her breath steamed with root-scented mist. She carried the silence of all who had been buried, and now, with her mother beneath her feet, she carried choice. And choice, in this place, was sacred. The villagers did not speak for 3 days. They swept their thresholds. They untied the red spirals from their doors. They placed bowls of water outside their homes, not for drinking, but for reflection. They waited for forgiveness, for fire, for whatever would come next. But what came was a seed. It appeared in the center of the square at dawn, a small round pod wrapped in threads of gold pine, humming with breath. No one knew who placed it there. No one dared touch it. So it stayed, and it pulsed. With each heartbeat, a new memory bloomed in those nearby. A child remembered the lullaby her sister sang before her choosing. A man remembered the warmth of his daughter's hand the morning she was buried. A woman remembered the girl she had named in secret, then allowed to be offered. Memories like pollen, heavy, inescapable, true. The priest, what was left of him, emerged from the chapel at sunset. His legs barely worked now, his spine bent like a dying stalk. But his eyes were wide, and his hands, though twisted, still knew the old signs. He knelt before the seed and traced a single spiral in the dirt, then placed his own tongue, shriveled, long severed, upon the ground beside it. A gift returned. The forest stirred. That night, the dream came to everyone. No distinctions now, child or elder, guilty or grieving. They all dreamed the same dream. A cradle carved from root and ash nestled beneath the oldest tree. In it, Mara, but not as she had been. Now she was crowned in moss. Her hands held not a child, but a seedling made of bone and bloom. And around her stood the others, the bent, all of them, Elisna among them. They did not speak, they only offered, the cradle, the root, the chance to remember rightly. And one by one in the dream, the villagers stepped forward and lay down inside. They woke with soil on their lips. Elisna walked the village at dawn, alone. The hollow children no longer followed. They had vanished back into the trees, or become them. No one was sure. The homes stood quiet, but not dead. People moved softly now. They carried things in twos. They sang when they swept. A new rhythm had settled in, not joyful, not fearful. Something older, a mourning that became ritual,
a grief that became gardening. One woman came to Elisna with a ribbon in her hand, the same one she had torn from her daughter the day she was taken. She knelt, placed the ribbon on the ground, and said nothing. Elisna touched the ribbon. It turned to sap, and then from the dirt a flower grew. Children began to plant things, not in gardens, in graveyards. They buried their old toys, their drawings, locks of hair, teeth lost too early. Each object grew something different: a tree that hummed, a vine that glowed at night, a bush that whispered names in sleep. The soil was no longer cursed. It had become ancestral. Mara did not return, but her presence remained. The flower that bloomed above her grave stayed open, never wilting. Birds began nesting near it. The wind bent slightly in its direction, and the villagers began calling it the cradle root. When the next choosing day came, the bells did not ring. There were no names in the bowl. No child was taken. Instead, the villagers gathered at the elder tree. They brought memories and laid them at its base. Letters, ribbons, songs sung under breath. And Elisna stood before them, wrapped in vines and veil. She said only one thing: grief is not meant to be buried. It is meant to be planted. Then she turned and walked into the forest. The trees parted for her, not in fear, but in recognition. And the village let her go, not because they had forgotten what she was, but because they had finally remembered who they were. The forest bloomed again, not with flowers, not with wheat or barley or fruit, but with something stranger, heavier. A harvest shaped by memory and rooted in grief. Crops rose taller than ever before, corn with silk as white as bone, pumpkins the size of water basins, tomatoes that bled when cut. They tasted rich, sweet, but behind the sweetness, there was something else. Bitterness. A reminder. Not all nourishment comes without price. The villagers did not question the bounty, not after what they had seen, not after what they had buried. They ate with reverence. They sang before each meal. They carved spoons from fallen branches near the elder root and served one another in silence. But none spoke while eating, because with each bite they could feel the forest listening. The wind changed. It no longer howled. It whispered. Names, stories, old lullabies once forgotten. And the land began to echo those names back, in the creak of trees, in the flicker of firelight, in the hush between footsteps. Elisna's name was heard most often, spoken not in fear, but in the hush of awe. Elisna herself was rarely seen now. Some claimed to catch glimpses of her between the trees, tall and spectral, vines trailing from her wrists, blossoms blooming from her ribs. Others said she lived beneath the elder root now, her body entwined with its veins, her breath the reason the crops grew and the ground no longer cried. Children left her offerings, drawings, shells, bits of song. Each morning the offerings would be gone. In their place, seedlings, small, quiet things, waiting to grow. But not everything that grew was good. One morning the well turned red, not blood, sap. It oozed up from the stones, thick and glistening. The healer tasted it and wept. It's not poison, it's grief. And from that day on, the villagers drank sparingly. They knew what they were sipping, not water, but sorrow distilled. Some crops whispered when picked. Some fields grew warm at dusk, pulsing beneath the farmer's feet like a heartbeat too large for the land. One man unearthed a carrot with a face, not carved, grown. It wept sap for 3 days before rotting. No one planted in that soil again. Still they harvested, because hunger never leaves a people, even when it comes dressed in flowers, even when it tastes like memory. And with each full basket, they bowed, not in gratitude, but in acknowledgement that this was not a gift, it was a rebalancing. They began calling it the harvest of sorrow. Each year the crops came thicker, stranger. Each year more names whispered through the trees, and each year they gathered beneath the elder root, not to offer another child, but to remember the ones already given. The choosing bowl had been burned, the bells were silent, but the forest still wanted to be seen, and so they gave it what it asked for, not sacrifice, but truth. They told the stories of daughters buried, of mothers who had wailed into their palms, of songs sung in secret when the village slept and the soil was still warm. The children listened. They asked questions. They were not told to be silent, because silence now was understood to be a kind of rot. Mara's flower still bloomed. It had not wilted. Its petals now changed color with the seasons, from white to gold to deep green to red like old blood. No one dared touch it, but sometimes on stormless nights they heard it chime, a sound like a cradle being rocked in the dark. And those who heard it dreamed of the bent. They dreamed of girls laughing beneath the trees, of roots braiding their hair, of sorrow held but no longer devouring. One child, the daughter of Senna the healer, claimed she met Elisna in a dream. She was a tree, but also a girl. She had mouths on her hands, but they didn't scream. They just said my name very gently. The villagers asked what else the dream showed, and the girl replied, "She asked me what I would plant, not what I would bury." After that, the villagers began planting their griefs, not with spades, but with confession. They wrote letters to the ones they had lost, words they'd never dared to say. They tied those letters in ribbon, placed them in the soil near the elder root, and waited. Some of those spots grew vines. Some sprouted nothing at all. But one night, a boy returned to the place where he'd buried a letter to his unborn sister and found a doll there, woven from pine needles and moss, her name stitched into the chest. The harvest of sorrow had become something else now, not retribution, not revival, but memory made tangible. And memory in this village had become the new currency of survival. The villagers still feared the forest, but they no longer fled it. They walked with it, and it with them. Elisna was never seen again in the flesh, but her voice returned each year, not in words, but in wind. When the leaves turned red and the sap thickened, a hum would pass through the village, low, warm, deep as root. And every villager knew what it was. A lullaby, not for the living, not for the dead, but for everything in between.
7 years passed, not swiftly, not softly, but like roots through bone, slow, deliberate, inevitable. The village endured. It no longer feared the forest, but it no longer trusted it either. Trust, they had learned, is not the same as survival, and the forest had survived far longer than they had. Children were no longer chosen. There was no bowl, no drawing of names, no lines of weeping mothers or bells rung under moonlight. Those rituals had withered like leaves in drought. Still, the villagers remembered. And so, on the 7th autumn, they gathered, not to bury, but to ask. They stood beneath the elder root, now taller than before, broader, darker, split with hairline mouths that no longer bled, only watched. Mara's flower still bloomed at its base, and behind it, a ring of saplings had grown, each where a letter had once been buried, or a ribbon laid down. They formed a circle, a cradle made of trees, and inside that cradle, the villagers waited. They brought no child, they brought no offering, they brought only questions. But the forest did not speak, not that day, not the next, not even when a boy wandered too close and laid his head against the bark, whispering, "If you still want one of us, take me." The tree did not move, the roots did not stir. And when the villagers returned the next morning, the boy was still there, asleep, alive, untouched. Something had changed. The village, unsure of what to do with its silence, carried on. They harvested the bitter corn, they drank from the sap-stained well, they hung ribbons not on doors, but on graves. They sang lullabies with no words, and they waited, not in dread, but in preparation, because the forest may forget nothing, but it remembers differently each time. The seasons turned, the soil breathed, the wind carried names, and Alisna, if she still existed, said nothing. She had vanished deeper into the trees, or become the trees. No one could be sure, but sometimes when the mist curled just right around the trunks, she could be seen, watching, smiling, blooming. Then one spring, a girl was born, to a mother who had once offered her ribbon in the circle, to a father who had carved names into bark and whispered them back with apology. The girl was strong, quiet, eyes like sap at dusk. She did not cry at birth. She only blinked once slowly and turned her head toward the window, toward the forest. As she grew, she hummed songs no one taught her. She carved spirals into the dirt with her heel. She plucked flowers from the sapling ring and wove them into crowns, crowns she never wore, only buried. And she called the tree by name, though no one had spoken that name in decades. "Alisna," she would whisper, "I remember you." By her 7th year, the whispers had returned, not loud, not violent, only curious. The forest watched again. The roots leaned a little closer to the paths. The wind paused before entering homes, and the elder root no longer bloomed. Mara's flower had turned gray, petals folded inward, as if it too was waiting. The villagers gathered once more. They did not bring the child. They brought her question. They carved it into the earth beside the elder tree. "Do you still want us?" The tree did not answer. The air did not stir.
Only silence replied, and for a time, that was enough. But in the dead of night, when all had gone home, when the child slept with sap beneath her fingernails and soil in her hair, something moved. A branch from the elder root cracked. It fell without sound, split along the grain, and from within its hollow core spilled hundreds of ribbons, old, new, unworn, all blank, waiting for names. And beneath the soil, unseen, something shifted, something opened, not in hunger, not in grief, but in invitation. The forest had not said yes, but it had not said no. And so the villagers began to whisper once more, of balance, of sacrifice, of soil that still sings in sleep. Because in a place like this, where trees remember the taste of love, and grief takes root like vine, there is no such thing as the end, only the next blooming, only the next humming, only the next bending.